It's science.
Who was that mustachioed man? Well, welcome to a course called Integrated Science. My name is Dr. F. Tink. You can call me Dr. E, and I'll be one of the instructors for this class. This video lesson will serve as an introduction to this course. In subsequent video lessons, we'll talk a little bit more about the details of how the course is going to be carried out. But first, let's ask the following questions. Why science? Why are you taking a science course, especially if you're a non-science major? Are you in the right class? Well, actually, I think you are in the right class, and you will see that this class is, in fact, designed for non-science majors. We're going to talk about how science and technology relates to our personal lives and to society. We're going to talk about some scientific disciplines and concepts, and in fact, we'll cover a lot of concepts. But more importantly, the purpose of this course is for you to gain knowledge about the role of science and technology in your lives. And the way to illustrate that is with a little exercise in the next slide or two. Basically, I'm going to compare a number of aspects of the lifestyle of people who live in the current century versus those people who lived about 100 years ago. And I'll show you what I mean in this slide. Currently, the world population is about 7 billion people. 100 years ago, it was much less, about 1.6 billion. Now, 100 years ago, and something like bathtubs, only 1 out of every 7 homes had a bathtub. Now, there's over 2 bathtubs in most homes. TVs. 100 years ago, television didn't exist, and now the average home has over 2 televisions. Telephones. Telephones did exist 100 years ago, but only 1 out of every 13 homes had a telephone. Now, almost 100% of Americans have a cell phone, but essentially everyone has a cell phone these days. Life expectancy. 100 years ago, the average life expectancy in the United States and other industrialized countries was 45 years of age. Now it's around 73 years of age. The major cause of death 100 years ago was infection, and followed by heart disease and cancer. Nowadays, less than 3% of the people die due to infections, due to bacterial infection, dysentery, things of that sort. But now heart disease, cancer, and diabetes are the major causes of death. Continuing, agriculture. In 1915, nearly half, 42% of people lived on a farm. Can you imagine? 42% lived on the farm. Now only 3% of the people in the United States live on the farm, and they produce all the food for the rest of us. Transportation. 100 years ago, the primary mode of transportation was horse-drawn carriage. Bicycles, boats, trains. Of course, now it's our personal car and airlines. How about the heating and cooling of homes? 100 years ago, this was done by burning wood or coal. And of course, there was no air conditioning. Whereas now we have electricity and our gas to heat our homes, and we have air conditioning everywhere. 100 years ago, the worldwide production of oil was 150 million barrels per year. I mean, that's just a number, but notice that now we have over 100 times as many barrels of oil produced per year. In terms of medicines, 100 years ago, there were very few vaccines. There was aspirin, and heroin, and quinine. There were a few drugs. But nowadays, there's a wide variety of drugs and surgical methods for medicine. Let's play another game, similar game. This is going to be the what if game. What if there were no electrical outlets in your room? Think about that. What if scientists had not understood the relationship between magnetism and electricity, which really is the basis for delivering electric current to our homes? What if there were no modern medicines or medical procedures? What if Alexander Fleming had not discovered penicillin, or Pasteur or Jenner had not discovered vaccines? What if there were no food stores around the corner for us to go and buy a snack, or buy groceries, or buy milk or fresh produce, fresh fish or meat? What if we had to grow all of our food in a garden and raise our own farm animals for slaughter? That's the way it was over 100 years ago. But now, of course, when we want to have a snack, we go to a convenience store or to a fast food restaurant. What if there were no synthetic materials for clothing or construction? You may not think about this a lot, but many of the clothes that you wear are made of synthetic fibers. If you actually look around you, unless you look at something that is unfinished wood or a metal surface, almost everything that you can see is some type of synthetic polymer or alloy or composite material. What if there were no cars or buses or planes to get us from one place to another? What if the Wright brothers had given up and not developed flight? What if the only time you could hear music is if you played an instrument yourself or if you went to a theater? Think about it. What if Thomas Edison hadn't developed the phonograph? Or if the transistor radio hadn't been developed, or the iPod had not been invented? What if the only means of communicating with people was writing letters, the Pony Express? What if Alexander Graham Bell had not invented the telephone? What if the internet had not been developed by scientists working for the federal government? What if we did not have cell phones? That's probably too hard to imagine, isn't it? On this slide, I'm going to trace the history of musical recordings and broadcast. Now, there's a lot of information on this slide, and I'm not going to expect you to know all of the details. I just want you to look at the progression. And notice the time span. This is about 150 years, current day we start with Thomas Edison in 1878 and we go to the current day. In 1878, Thomas Edison invented the phonograph. And then about 10 years later, Emil Berliner invented a phonograph that records on disc, a disc which we now call a phonograph record or vinyl disc. 50 years or so later, magnetic tape recordings were developed. And then in 1952, American Bandstand, hosted by Dick Clark, brought music to us over television. And in the mid-50s, transistor radios and phonograph players, what we call stereos, were developed, leading to boom boxes. If you noticed in the right, it may look like a very funny photograph now, but this is the size of some of the radios that people would carry around just to have portable music. There was the 8-track tape, which probably no one has seen in your generation. Audio cassettes. You may have seen some of these cassettes that your parents may have still lying around and haven't thrown away yet. 1981, MTV debuted on television. I want my MTV. 2000, MP3 players, getting smaller, and then the iPod and iTunes. And of course, now we can play our music on almost any electronic device, smartphones, iPads, or computers. All of this has happened in about 150 years. Now, at the end of the lecture, I'm going to talk about an assignment that's going to be something similar to this for you to complete. The impression you might get is science is primarily done to lead to technological advances to make our lives more comfortable. And yes, it is done for that purpose. But initially, science is pursued to understand patterns in behavior in nature and to predict outcomes of nature. And yes, this does lead to practical solutions and to technologies such as the ability to listen to music on our cell phone and the ability to have fresh foods delivered to us at our convenience. But also science is done to satisfy our curiosity about what makes things tick in the world around us. Each of these purposes can drive scientific discovery. Now, you may be thinking, but I don't know if I'm curious enough to be a scientist. And, everyone has different levels of curiosity and has different kinds of curiosity. And that leads me to recall a poem by Rudyard Kipling. And this poem goes, I keep 6 honest serving men. They taught me all I knew. Their names are what and why and when and how and where and who. It's about curiosity. It's about asking questions. And scientists tend to ask questions like what and how, whereas other people may ask questions more like where and who and why. But we all are curious. That's part of being human. But science is a process by which those who are primarily curious about the what and the how investigate these patterns and behaviors of nature. Now, the purpose of this course is to enable you to understand the relevance of science to societal issues and the breadth and interrelatedness of scientific concepts. We'll be stressing this interrelatedness. And we'll be talking about the nature of scientific inquiry and critical thinking. And we'll also add a healthy dose of historical context related to the key scientific discoveries. And I stress again, this course is specifically designed for non-science majors. The goals are really for you to gain an effective citizens level understanding of science, or, as it's sometimes described, to develop scientific literacy. And let me also point out that in this course, we will say it's okay to be skeptical. And in fact, that's a very important characteristic of scientists and how science advances, by people asking questions. We will touch on the various disciplines of science, that are some of which are listed here. Physics and genetics and chemistry and geology. We'll touch a little bit on all of these. But more importantly, what we will try to do in this course is to integrate our coverage of the concepts and show how all of these relate together. For example, we will be talking about energy in many contexts, and we'll show how energy is important in physics and in chemistry and in biology and in living systems. And let me close with another quote, and this is from someone named Alan Lightman. Now, Alan Lightman is a professor at MIT, professor of physics, but he is also from Memphis, Tennessee. So I thought you might find this interesting. And a quote I have from Dr. Lightman: "I'm spellbound by the plays of Shakespeare, and I am spellbound by the second law of thermodynamics. The great ideas in science are part of our cultural heritage." Okay, we'll pause. This is the end of the first video lecture. If you go to the next file in this sequence, you'll have the assignment that I mentioned of creating a sort of brief history of some particular topic, such as food production, sports, banking and finance, transportation, air flight, agriculture, communications, medicine, etc. The assignment will be explained to you, including the topic that you should select. We'll see you a little later.